It was a late night on a desolate stretch of highway, the kind of lonely road that rarely saw traffic. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the barren landscape. That's when I noticed him, a young man in his late 20s, standing by the roadside. His frayed denim jacket and worn jeans hinted at a life of hardship. His hair was a chaotic mess, and his face looked wild and unkempt. As I slowed my car, he approached with a grin that felt unsettling, as though he was hiding something behind it. Despite the warnings echoing in my mind, I unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in without hesitation. "Thanks for picking me up," he said, his voice gravelly and rough. "I didn't expect anyone to stop for me out here." "Not many people do," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, trying to gauge him. "Where are you headed?" "Just a little farther down," he said, waving his hand vaguely. "Just trying to get to a friend's place. You know how it is." The silence stretched between us as I resumed driving, the hum of the tires against the asphalt the only sound. I stole glances at him. He seemed to be scanning the surroundings, as if he were looking for something, or someone. "Bae, do you believe in fate?" he suddenly asked, turning his gaze on me, his eyes piercing. "I guess so," I replied, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "I do," he said with an unsettling smile. "I believe everything happens for a reason." The road was winding now, bordered by thick trees that loomed ominously in the dark. I felt an urge to turn back, but the thought of leaving him stranded out here made me uneasy. As we drove, he began to share stories that grew increasingly disturbing, tales of people he'd met on the road, strange encounters, and bizarre coincidences. I listened, my heart racing with every unsettling detail. He recounted a story about a family he'd met who vanished after picking him up years ago, their car found abandoned in a ravine. "Funny, isn't it?" he mused, a glimmer of madness in his eyes. "Sometimes you just don't know who you're letting into your life." I forced a chuckle, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. "Yeah, I guess you're right." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" "No," I replied, too quickly, realizing how hollow it sounded. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the car shifted. The temperature seemed to drop, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. My instincts screamed for me to find a reason to let him out, but I didn't want to provoke him. Suddenly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. My heart raced as he examined it, turning it over in his hands. "This little thing has seen a lot of action," he said, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. "Sometimes you just have to do what you have to do to survive." "Put that away," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice trembled. "Relax," he chuckled, an unsettling laughter echoing in the confined space. "I'm not going to hurt you. At least, not yet." Panic surged through me as I glanced around for a way to escape. But the road was desolate, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. "Do you ever wonder what you would do if you were in a life or death situation?" he asked, tilting his head, a twisted smile creeping across his lips. "What lengths would you go to?" "Look, man, just let me know where to drop you off," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned back in his seat, still clutching the knife. "You know, I'm not even sure I want to get out yet. There's something about you. Something interesting." My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I needed to think fast. I spotted a dim light in the distance, an old gas station. "All right, I'll drop you off there," I said, my voice firming up. He didn't respond but continued to stare out the window, a disturbing grin stretching across his face. The station was deserted, flickering lights casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. I pulled in, heart pounding as I turned off the engine. "Get out," I demanded. He looked at me, surprise flashing across his face before that unnerving smile reappeared. "What's the rush?" "Get out," I shouted, adrenaline surging through me. All right," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. He swung the door open and stepped into the night, the cool air wrapping around him like a shroud. I watched him linger by the car, his face cast in the flickering light of the gas station. "You know, this isn't the end for me," he said, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "I'll be around. I always am." As I turned the key to start the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, those wild eyes locked onto mine. I didn't dare look back as I hit the gas, a wave of dread washing over me as I sped into the darkness. Hours later, as I pulled into my driveway, a sense of relief flooded over me. I had escaped whatever darkness he carried. The night was thick with fog as I drove along the winding back roads, the headlights barely cutting through the haze. I was heading home after a long shift at the hospital, eager to put the day behind me. The silence of the car was comforting, broken only by the faint sound of the radio playing softly in the background. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, I spotted a figure standing by the roadside, partially obscured by the mist. My instincts flared what was a girl doing out here alone. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to gauge her reaction. She stepped closer, her features becoming clearer. A striking young woman with long, dark hair and an almost ethereal quality to her. She had an unusual aura, a mix of charm and something unsettling. "Yes, please," she said softly, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "I've been waiting for so long." I unlocked the doors, and she slipped into the back seat, settling into the shadows. I glanced at her through the rearview mirror, and a shiver crept down my spine as I noticed the way her eyes glinted, sharp and perceptive. "Where do?" I asked, keeping my tone light despite the unease curling in my stomach. "Just drive," she replied, a cryptic smile playing on her lips. As I resumed my journey, the air grew heavy with an inexplicable tension. She sat silently in the back, and I felt her gaze penetrating me, as if she were studying my every move. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked suddenly, her tone unsettlingly calm. I glanced at her through the mirror, confused by the question. I guess it depends on what you mean by fate." "What if every choice you make leads you to a predetermined end?" she pressed, her eyes unwavering. "What if there are paths we're meant to follow?" Her questions felt almost like a riddle, and I could feel my heart racing as I tried to shake off the ominous feeling creeping into my thoughts. "I think we all make our own choices," I replied, hoping to steer the conversation into safer territory. She chuckled softly, but it was devoid of warmth. "Is that what you truly believe? That we're not influenced by forces beyond our control?" Before I could answer, she pointed suddenly out the window, a sharp gesture that made me flinch. "Stop the car," she demanded, her voice low and intense. "What?" "Why?" I asked, my instincts screaming at me to keep driving. "Stop," she insisted, and the urgency in her tone left no room for doubt. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands trembling on the wheel. "What's going on?" I asked, glancing back at her. She leaned closer to the window, her gaze locked on something in the distance. "There. The cabin. You need to drop me off there." My heart sank as I followed her finger. Through the fog, I could just make out the outline of a dilapidated cabin, its dark silhouette looming ominously among the trees. It looked ancient, almost otherworldly, like something out of a horror story. "No way," I said, shaking my head. "I can't just leave you there. It doesn't look safe." "Please," she insisted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I have to go. It's important." I hesitated, torn between my instincts and the bizarre allure of her presence. Something about her felt otherworldly, as if she were a figment of my imagination. The weight of her gaze pressed down on me, compelling me to obey. "Fine," I said reluctantly, gripping the wheel tighter as I drove toward the cabin. As we approached, the air turned cold, the temperature dropping dramatically. I could feel the atmosphere shift, as if the cabin exuded an energy that sent a chill down my spine. I parked the car, my heart pounding in my chest. "This is it," I said, unable to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Are you sure you want to get out?" She didn't respond. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out into the mist, her silhouette blending with the shadows. I watched as she walked toward the cabin, the fog swallowing her up. Suddenly, panic surged through me. "Wait," I called, but it was too late. As I blinked, she vanished completely, disappearing into the darkness like smoke in the wind. My heart raced as confusion and dread washed over me. I turned in my seat, hoping against hope she'd reappear, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind whispering through the trees and the unsettling silence of the night. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, but the fear clawing at my chest was suffocating. I needed to leave. With shaking hands, I slammed the car into reverse and spun the wheel, my tires kicking up gravel as I tore away from the cabin. The road ahead felt endless, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if the forest itself had come alive. As I drove, the fog thickened around me, wrapping me in an icy embrace. The weight of her questions lingered in my mind, their meanings echoing in the silence. What if every choice you make leads you to a predetermined end? I shook my head, trying to dispel the darkness. I needed to focus on getting home. But as I glanced back at the rearview mirror, I swore I saw her standing there, her eyes glowing in the shadows, a silent reminder of the path I had taken. With a shuddering breath, I pressed down on the gas, determined to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. The engine roared to life, and I felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate need to escape. But the fog continued to thicken, swirling around my car like a living thing. The road felt treacherous, and I had to squint to see more than a few feet ahead. Each turn felt longer and more dangerous, the shadows looming closer. Suddenly, the radio crackled and went silent. I slammed the button to turn it back on, but it was dead. A heavy silence enveloped me, amplifying the sound of my own breathing and the thudding of my heart. I reached for my phone, only to find that there was no signal. Panic surged within me, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened. As I sped into the night, I felt a weight lift, the fog receding behind me. But even as I drove away, I knew she would linger in the shadows, a ghost of choices not taken, an echo of the road not traveled. I drove into the darkness, my heart still racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that some encounters are meant to stay in the shadows, forever haunting the corners of our minds. It was the kind of night where the rain felt endless. Sheets of water pounded the windshield of my car, and the wipers struggled to keep up, barely offering any clarity as I drove down the winding, empty road. After a double shift at the hospital, I was tired, bone tired, the kind of fatigue that made the world feel distant, unreal. The clock on the dashboard read just past 2 a.m. When I spotted him, a man standing at the side of the road, drenched, unmoving, his face obscured by a hood. He stood perfectly still, like a figure carved from stone, the rain bouncing off him as if he didn't notice or care. I should have kept driving. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was the exhaustion clouding my judgment or some misplaced sense of duty as a nurse. Against all instinct, I slowed down and rolled down my window a few inches, enough for the cold, damp air to sneak in. "Hey," I called out, "do you need a ride?" He didn't respond. Didn't even seem to hear me. For a few seconds he stood in silence, his head bowed. Then, Slowly, he raised his hand, not to wave or give any kind of friendly acknowledgement. "No," he pointed, straight ahead, into the darkness beyond the road, toward the dense, looming trees. I followed his gesture, squinting into the rain and gloom. I couldn't see anything but shadow, the dark outline of the forest pressing in on either side of the highway. My skin prickled with unease. "What's out there?" I asked, my voice quieter now, as if I were afraid to disturb something. No answer. The man remained silent, his arm still pointing, directing me toward whatever lay in the darkness. I should have driven off, left him standing there in the rain. But curiosity, that damned human weakness, pulled at me. With a sigh, I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, clicked it on, and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit me like a wall, instantly soaking me to the bone. I shivered as I approached the man, but he didn't acknowledge me, didn't move. He just kept pointing. I hesitated, staring at the spot where his finger led, into the impenetrable woods. The beam of my flashlight cut through the rain, revealing nothing but wet trees and underbrush. My heart started to pound in my chest, a warning from my gut to get back in the car. Yet, my feet moved forward, almost against my will. The man didn't follow. He stood motionless as I stepped off the road and into the woods, the light from my flashlight flickering slightly as the trees closed in around me. The rain sounded softer here, muted by the thick canopy overhead, but the silence that came with it was oppressive. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I kept going, deeper into the woods, my footsteps squelching in the mud. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step, but I couldn't place its source. I swung the flashlight from side to side, its beam revealing only more trees and the dark spaces between them. Then, just when I was about to give up and turn around, I saw it. Two gleaming eyes, reflecting back at me from the shadows. They were low to the ground, too far apart to belong to any ordinary animal. They stared unblinkingly at me, shimmering in the beam of the flashlight like twin mirrors. My breath hitched. I took a step backward, my heart thundering in my chest. The eyes didn't move. They just watched, cold and silent. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice shaky, barely audible. Then, a low, rumbling sound filled the air, a growl, but not like any I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural, like it was coming from somewhere far beneath the earth. A primal, ancient sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, sprinting through the woods, slipping in the mud, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly in front of me. Branches whipped at my arms and face, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to the car. The growling grew louder behind me, closer now. I didn't dare look back. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I pushed on, fueled by sheer terror. The trees began to thin, and finally I broke through the tree line and saw the road. My car was still there, headlights on, engine running. But the man, he was gone, vanished, as if he had never been there. The spot where he had stood was empty, just wet pavement and rain. I didn't stop to wonder where he'd gone. I sprinted to the car, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, the tires spinning for a moment before finding traction. I sped away from the woods, not daring to look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see. The drive home was a blur of rain and fear. My mind raced with what I had seen, those eyes, the man, the unnatural stillness of the forest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been an animal, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, the engine still running. I couldn't bring myself to get out. I felt wrong, like something had followed me. My clothes were still soaked through, sticking to my skin, but I couldn't shake the cold, creeping dread that had settled in my chest. Eventually, I forced myself to step out of the car, rushing to my front door and locking it behind me. I flicked on every light in the house, trying to chase away the shadows. But no matter how bright the room was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, every light on, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Sleep was impossible. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes in the woods, the man who'd vanished without a trace, and the terrible, gnawing feeling that something had followed me home. Even now, days later, I can't shake it. I see things in the corners of my vision, shapes that disappear when I turn to look. I hear whispers in the dead of night, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I swear I can feel those gleaming eyes staring back at me from the darkness. Watching, waiting,